All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this next session on day 3 of the Smart Protein Summit, when we're exploring smart proteins intersections with public and planetary health. Just as a recap, we've heard on day 1 about the state of the industry, which was extremely exciting. As we've said multiple times, it's surreal to see how far things have come. On day 2, we talked about laying down a roadmap for the future, particularly how smart protein can be a pillar of a new green economy for India, create a number of jobs, and critically, I think, benefit a number of stakeholder groups. And as we talk about India, you cannot ignore agriculture and farmers as a key, perhaps the key stakeholder group that exists. And we have a fantastic panel here today that has deep expertise in working with farmers and agri value chain development. And the idea today, as you saw in the previous panel, is to have a series of conversations and build shared understanding across various areas, whether it's nutrition, agriculture, climate change, etc. Talk about how smart protein intersects with these and is in fact a critical pillar of these moving into the future, and then identify action steps for how we can get to a place where we're actually moving forward into these spaces. So without further ado, I'm going to actually introduce our 3 panelists, because I think they can speak far better than I to the potential intersections with the agri value chain. I just want to quickly say beforehand, I know that most of the audience for the Smart Protein Summit this year is India-based, so it will not be lost on you that agriculture is a key piece of the future. But for anyone that doesn't know this, over 50% of our population and of our population is still reliant on the agricultural sector, right? So this is something that we cannot get away from. It is a key piece of our future. It's the lifeblood of our economy in many ways, and this is a critical conversation to have, especially at this juncture. So I'll quickly do an introduction to our three panelists. Firstly, Mr. Dharani Kanth Koganti. He leads the agriculture and fisheries team at Invest India, which is India's investment promotion agency. A wonderful group, by the way. We have a couple of team members who've come from Invest India as well. Invest India works with industry bodies and various ministries to promote ease of doing business in the agriculture and allied sectors. Dharani himself is an alumnus of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at National University of Singapore, and has previously worked with the government of Chhattisgarh to strengthen rural agri value chains, and with ICRISAT and FAO to document best practices emerging in Agritech in India. Welcome, Dharani. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks
You're
for
on. Yeah, great. I've said you're on mute so many times during the summit, but thanks. I think you got it. Dr. Srivalli Krishnan next is Senior Program Officer, Agricultural Development at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in India. She leads food systems work in Asia, and previously she was the Development Assistant Specialist with USAID India as the Coordinator for Agriculture and Climate Change Programs. She's also worked with the Australian government's Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, and she holds a PhD in crop breeding and genetics from TERI, the Energy and Resources Institute. She's done graduate work with Cornell, Masters in Life Sciences from DU, and has advanced diplomas in IP law. So this is a vast, I think, tapestry of expertise that Srivalli is bringing to this panel. Thank you for joining us, Srivalli.
Thanks, Varun, and lovely to be here.
Excellent. And finally, Ashu Sikri. Ashu is leading product innovation at Digital Green, a global development organization that empowers smallholder farmers to lift themselves out of poverty by harnessing the collective power of technology and grassroots level partnerships. He has previously been a fintech entrepreneur, impact-focused venture capitalist, and private equity analyst. Ashu studied economics and philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. Thank you for joining us, Ashu. Wonderful. Okay, so as everyone in the audience can tell, and as I said, this is a wonderful panel that encompasses expertise across industry, agri value chains, government, etc. I'm going to start with you, Ashu. It's just firstly a round of questions about what you do. Could you speak a little bit to how your background led you to the agri value chain and what Digital Green is doing across India and other countries to strengthen agri value chains?
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned in the intro the notion of leveraging technology and grassroots partnerships to support smallholder farmers. So I'll describe in a bit more detail what that means. Some of our flagship work has been working in partnership with the government providers of extension and advisory services. Agricultural extension, for those who don't know, is sort of communicating techniques and practices by which farmers can increase their yield, improve their sustainability, and just become more productive and increase income. And so we spend a lot of our time thinking about how to make those systems more effective and efficient. One of the ways that we do that is by helping those organizations produce and disseminate videos that are produced by farmers for farmers that demonstrate how to actually implement some of these practices. We've built upon that work to get into areas like helping farmers form virtual aggregation models, FPOs, which is something that I'm sure we'll talk about more as we continue the discussion. And to give you a sense of scale, we have we've reached about 2.5 million farmers globally. The bulk of our work is in India. We also work in Ethiopia and a few other countries. To get a sense for what it looks like tangibly, all the videos that our partners have produced are on our YouTube channel. There's about 8,000 videos, open access, that have been viewed over 60 million times around the world. And there's lots of independent analysis and evidence that suggests that this approach is really effective at helping farmers adopt practices that improve their yield and productivity.
Yeah, thank you, Ashu. And by the way, those numbers have always been increasing every time we've talked. Like, so every few months when we talk, the number of farmers is increasing, the number of projects is increasing. I should also state at the outset that I've been in Government of India Ministry of Agriculture meetings where there've been amassed a number of different large corporations and then people from Digital Green. And the amount of fascination that is focused on Digital Green in these conversations is just huge. I mean, we have mega corporations trying to talk to the government, and then we have Digital Green, which is drawing all of the attention. And I think it's because you're doing such fantastic, fascinating work. So thank you for that. Let me move on to Srivalli. Obviously, very many people, if not all people, know the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and you're leading a lot of great agriculture work. We've talked at length about this in the past, and I'd love for you to give us a flavor of the work that BMGF has done in India and what your priorities are currently.
Thanks, Varun. So BMGF's work in India started way back in 2007. And just to give you a perspective, agriculture development is one of the foundation's oldest portfolio and one of the largest portfolio, if I were to mention. And we've been on an annual scale, at least investing anywhere between $20 to $30 million for our development work, in particularly with agriculture in India. And now we are also expanding our footprint to other neighboring countries in South Asia. Our main focus for our agriculture development work is basically a look at country-led inclusive agriculture transformation, which rests on 4 main levers: improving agriculture productivity, improving farmer incomes, looking at improving nutritional status, as well as women's economic empowerment. We achieve these 4 levers through 2 key pathways. One of them is diversification, which includes diversification from staples to high-value agriculture, and in this context, basically looking at highly nutritive crops. And the second pathway is markets. And we feel that these 2 levers are critical to achieve the 4 impact pathways that we see. Our main focus states in India are Bihar, UP, and Odisha. However, we are also expanding a footprint in AP, Telangana, Madhya Pradesh, and so on and so forth. We work very closely with the federal government, the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Rural Development, Ministry of Animal Husbandry, and as well as Ministry of Women and Child Development and FSSAI. And at the state government, we work again very closely with the state government machinery. And some of our flagship programs have been able to reach several millions of farmers on the ground, whether it is through improving productivity, bringing digital systems, to improving transparency to some of the schemes that the state government is rolling out, to going all the way to access to better quality breeds in dairy animals and so forth. So we have a range of programs that are spanning the sector. And just in terms of the perspective for this particular work, for us, when we talk about high nutritive value or quality food, as we would call, it is important that we take protein as one of the critical entry points to not only address nutritional deficiency, but also to be able to look at how we can bring in more incomes in the hands of farmers. So we definitely think that there is this access and availability, which is a very, very critical entry point when we talk about protein.
Thank you so much, Srivalli. And I should state also that both for Srivalli as well as Ashu, this work has been particularly critical during the COVID-19 pandemic, when supply chains have been disrupted and there's been a lot of need to, I think, further support the agri supply chain. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Let me move on to Dharani. Could you tell us a little bit about the fascinating work that Invest India does in general, as well as the work that you specifically do with the Agri and Fisheries, on the Agri and Fisheries side with the ministries?
Yeah, thanks, Varun. So, Invest India, just to introduce to the audience, Invest India, because I believe Srivalli has been working with various colleagues of mine, and if Ashu might have, I'll just introduce. So, Invest India is Government of India's investment promotion agency. We are placed under DPIIT, and as an organization, we are owned by the Government of India, DPIIT, state governments, and industry associations, including CII, FICCI, and NASCOM. So we are uniquely placed between the government and the industry, and the whole objective of creating this entity is to promote ease of doing business or promote foreign direct investment into the country. So, as such, within the larger umbrella of Invest India, our team, I work under the team, I look at the teams of agriculture and fisheries. What we predominantly do is promote ease of doing business in this particular subsegment. So, last year during the pandemic, a special cell called the Project Development Cells were created within each of these ministries, and they have been asked to look at how we can create investable projects, relook at any laws or regulations that are hindering growth of the sector, and also work with industries, importers, exporters, and look at if we can do import substitution by sourcing from here or growing within the country, working with farmers, or even like aquaculture farmers and all. So as I talk to you right now, I'm in Arunachal and Zero district, where if you see a lot of Chilean kiwi is a lot of kiwi is imported from different countries across the world. So we are just looking if we can bring chili into the rest of the country. So we have got a big importer who we are showing him the farms over here, and we are making him procure to Delhi and sell it over here. So such kind of work we do broadly. And also any opportunities that are there which are untapped, we try to bring them to the forefront and work with the likes of all of you. Like we could always collaborate and work together.
Yeah, thank you, Dharani. And it's always been a pleasure collaborating with Invest India. There's a group of very dynamic, usually quite young but expert folks they have a roving brief around different states, different industries. It's really fascinating to work with Invest India and take forward industrial development, which of course for us in Smart Protein is very important. Let me stay with you, Dharani, for the next question. Could you speak a little bit so we've interacted and talked about how Smart Protein might fit into your priorities, particularly in the context of seaweed and other things that you were doing. Right? Could you speak a little bit, perhaps on a theoretical level, of where agricultural priorities currently are from where you're seeing? And I'll pose the same question to the other panelists as well. And what the broad scope of your work is relative to a new innovative industry like this. What are the priorities currently?
From both, if I were to talk from both the perspective of agriculture and the aquaculture sector. So, with respect to seaweed, we have been trying to work on getting industry players to invest in this and even promote the availability of the biomass which the industry people need at this point of time. So we're trying to work on those with clusters, be it in Gujarat or be it in Tamil Nadu over there with governments, with private entities. We are trying to understand what are the regulatory challenges for that and look at. So right now, certain issues have been raised. Only certain commercial varieties are being promoted, whereas localized ones are not being promoted. So we are just trying to open up already. A lot of research has been done on this part. We are looking at opportunities, how this can be opened up for like entrepreneurs at an MSME level who can take these technologies to the market. That is one aspect of when it comes to seaweed. Now, if you come to look at it from an agriculture perspective, just to take the example of Telangana, where after the Kaleshwaram project has come, and a lot of farmers are actually doing mostly paddy, and the government is striving towards moving them towards higher income crops. So this is where we come into picture and try to work with the likes of even ADM has been, we have been working with them on certain issues, industry issues that they've been facing. So we are working towards connecting farmers and traders together so that and educate them that if you give incentives, farmers are willing to do it. At the end of the day, farmer is a smart enough person. He'll not be growing all the time paddy. They're doing paddy because they have an MSP for that. Like that, if we can do it for pulses, yes, they're willing to shift for that. So that kind of exposure, working with FPOs and working with the larger players who want to procure, we are facilitating that. To give one example, a large Middle Eastern player is looking to source different kinds of grains and pulses from India. So we are working with them to connect them with FPOs and larger cooperatives to source predominantly from India at this point of time. Such kind of work, yes, we are working towards it.
Got it, Dharani. And you actually raised a number of different challenges there that I want to get into later, right? So there's obviously bringing MSMEs or entrepreneurs into the space and actually getting them to integrate into the value chain. There's regulation, and you use seaweed as a lens to evaluate how we can move forward, and pulses, of course. Ashu, I want to go to you with a similar question. Obviously, at Digital Green, you're involved in agricultural value chain development, benefiting farmers, really implementing the advancement of agriculture and value chains. Could you tell us a little bit from your perspective what you're seeing as the priorities for agriculture in the country? And also, I think, go into, just for the audience, what is a value chain? What are the various levels of a value chain? You mentioned FPOs earlier, and Dharani also mentioned that. What goes into the development of a value chain over time?
Sure. So one thing I'll highlight maybe for Digital Green that maybe is unique about us is that we focus on what we'll call small scale producers, right? So this is 1 hectare or smaller plots. And that the reality is that 40% of the land approximately in India is operated by smallholder farmers, and 80% of land holdings, right, are smallholders. So this is a huge population. If I had to sort of synthesize it, I think some of the pathways that Srivalli talked about, all 4 of them are actually critical. If I had to underline one, I'd say sort of access to markets, right? And everyone has seen kind of what's happening politically with the farm bills and the debates around, corporatization, industrialization of those. And so access to markets is critical, right? Is MSP going to be around or not? And what does all that mean? From our side, I think there's a few things that we see as...
Ashu, sorry, let me interrupt you. You said, what does all that mean? Could I ask you also to define MSP? Because I think just for, let's just take a clean slate here and assume that people don't know what that is. And move on from that. Yeah.
Sure. So the minimum support price, there's a schedule of crops. I'd say it's about a dozen, maybe a bit more than that, which the government procures. And the government's procurement is largely focused on delivering subsidized food grains to lower income populations, right? So that's done through kind of the Food Corporation of India and through the public distribution system, the PDS shops and ration shops that exist throughout the country. And so there's a schedule every season that gets published and updated that sort of tracks with inflation growth, and it sets in theory, a minimum price, right, for certain commodities, the large grains that you could imagine, rice, wheat, etc. Not every single farmer everywhere in the country sells at MSP, right? There's a lot of distribution about that, and so that in part is what muddles the debate around the topic. But maybe for the purposes of this discussion, the way to think about it is, the government is a large buyer of grains. They set a price that in some cases does set a floor price that's followed in the mandis, and in some cases is not necessarily the case. And so that's MSP. And I'm sure Srivalli and others can opine more on it. The point about improved access to markets being kind of a critical focus, I think there's a few things that we see that are pretty important where the intersection with this initiative might come to fruition. One is that small plot sizes means you have diseconomies of scale, right? As a small farmer, you're sort of buying inputs at retail prices, and then you're selling your outputs at kind of depressed wholesale prices because you don't have much bargaining power. So when we talk about FPOs, farmer producer organizations, they're sort of building on the idea of agricultural co-ops, which obviously have a incredible history and incredible scale, but some changes in terms of the governance mechanisms and more flexibility in terms of how they can operate. And so those FPOs enable small farmers to do virtual aggregation, right? To pool together and actually achieve some economies of scale on procuring inputs and then bargaining for, with buyers because they have a larger volume that's available for sale. So we're big believers conceptually in the potential for that kind of model. There's a big push. There's some success stories. There's some, it's a fledged. I would describe it as sort of still a nascent space with lots of room for growth. And so when I think about Smart Protein and I think about what does an FPO need to be successful, they need reliable offtake from large buyers who are clear about what their requirements are and actually come through and buy at the price that they say they're going to buy at, right? And if there are, if those conditions exist, then I think you have a strong basis for around which farmers can then collectivize and be part of FPOs that can be quite successful and thrive. I think another thing that's pretty powerful is when you talked about the importance of agriculture to the economy. I mean, productivity is critical, right? So it's maybe 15% of GDP in terms of value, but 40% of employment, right? One theory is, hey, just get everyone off the farm, right, and move into higher value occupations. That's fair. Another theory, and I think the reality is you have to do all these things, is increase productivity and do more value addition, right, locally on the farm. And so when you think about certain value chains, maybe there's room for, especially when you have some aggregation that's happening, more primary value addition happening kind of farm side, right? So making it possible to make certain capital expenditure investments that allow for processing. So in the past, we've worked with, in Jharkhand, the MKSP program, which collectivizes women farmers, and they've gotten into processing arhar or tur dal, right? And that's allowed them from selling just, a grain as it is to actually doing the processing and capturing more of the value chain and owning more of it. And so that brings us to the question you asked about what is value chain. It's really all the steps and all the actors and stakeholders that exist between a raw commodity being produced, whether that's in the sea, on the farm, wherever it might be, all the way to being finally consumed by the consumer. And one thing I'd say that's maybe worth thinking about when you think about agricultural supply chains, I think this is true of fisheries as well. It might not be, which is that in most food systems, and this varies by crop, a consumer rupee. So suppose I'm spending a rupee at my local retail store, something like 10 paisa of that is going to the primary producer, to the farmer. The rest of it is being captured in between, right? A lot of it goes to the retailers, the marketers, kind of the consumer-facing interface where you procure and buy your food. A lot of it happens in kind of that middle stage of value addition and processing and packaging and what's called grading and sorting and trading and wholesaling. And then the remainder is what's available to the person who's actually, in the fields, buying seeds and, applying fertilizer and growing crops, right? So I think thinking about what that breakdown looks like of that consumer rupee and how it gets spread across the different value chain actors and who's really adding value versus being in more of like an extractive position is something that we think about. And when you're talking about shaping a new industry, you have a chance to kind of do that in a way that's fair and equitable and sustainable, which is exciting.
Thank you. And by the way, sorry for the interruption. I think I always love hearing from you on all of these things, and I figured the audience would as well. I want to come back to the point that you made closer to the beginning of that when you were talking about guaranteed sustained offtake in my next question. But I'm going to move to Srivalli right now. Srivalli, obviously, Ashu's mentioned a lot about what a value chain consists of and how to develop it. I think a fascinating aspect of this, and Ashu mentioned, with a new industry, we can build from the ground up, keeping the producer in mind, right? One of the things that we've talked about, or I've heard you mention in public forums, is that given that so many farmers in India are subsistence farmers or smallholders, and you mentioned it at the beginning of this as well, there is an opportunity here actually to impact their nutritional status at scale, right? So I'd love for you to kind of just frame that, because a lot of the discussions that we are having today seem like separate discussions: nutrition, agriculture, climate, but they're not. We're talking about things that are very interrelated, and oftentimes the people affected are the most vulnerable people. So could you talk a little bit about that vulnerability and how we can impact nutritional status of the farmer by integrating with the agri value chain?
Sure, Varun. So I would just like to, give a little bit of a perspective. As you mentioned in your starting point, Varun, that in India, we've got more than 50% of our population which is dependent on agriculture as their primary source of livelihood, which means that is the same 50% of the population which is also the largest consumer of your goods and services, but also the food part of it. Earlier, there used to be a notion that, if you're talking about small scale producer, they mainly consume what they grow. But as in now, we have seen more and more, evidence that is coming in about 60 to 70% of food that is being consumed, even in a rural household, comes from the markets. So what the signal as a farmer, as a consumer is sending to the market is also responding. So just to give you an example, even if you go in very, very rural areas, you would find the small sized kurkure packets, because that is what the farmer is responding to. So the question that I would say is, what would it take to make that consumer, who's also your producer, to be nutritionally better off? And we have done a series of research programs and research evidence generation programs. And based on some of the findings, as I speak, these papers are also getting published, is that we have specifically looked at pulses. And in a state like Bihar, where we had done some quantitative and qualitative survey to understand what are the behavior and the, what are the incentives of a farmer, one, to grow pulses, and secondly, not only grow, what are the incentives to consume the pulses. One of the very clear evidence is that if you just compare the household which is growing versus not growing, there is a clear cut demarcation that the households that produce the commodity tend to consume more than those households that don't produce that. However, the bigger signal to make that decision on consumption of the produce is the market signal. So, for instance, if they get a very high market price for the produce, they will likely to sell their entire produce than consume, which is a very clear signal that you see, which is something that you would expect a normal human behavior to be there. So one of the things that we could look at, specifically looking at your producer also as your consumer, is to understand what are the market pathways, number one. Number two, can you look at intra value chain? And when I talk about intra value chain is, for example, if I am producing tur dal and it is going all the way to a mill to get processed and then gets going into the market and comes back into the same rural economy, there are all these costs that get added. And if I had paid the farmer 8 rupees a kilo for that dal when I was purchasing it in unprocessed, the same farmer is purchasing the processed one for 60 or 70 rupees. So between that 8 and 60 to 70 rupees, I agree there is a costing on processing, there's a costing on packaging, there's a costing that the private sector moves on transportation. But if we talk about basically intra value chains, then we could look at some primary value addition happening on farm that can reduce these transaction costs and allow for that producer to also consume that produce at a reasonable cost, because we could save costings on transportation, on logistics, and make sure that there is a local enterprise that is being created that can really take benefit from these produce. I, however, also have to be mindful that that does not say that you should not export it outside of that geography, because that's a huge market. There is always a portion which is marketable surplus, which in current situation is a lot of waste, the food loss and waste that is being categorized. And if we can just plug in those gaps, then we will be able to really make sure some of these intra value chains are also functional.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, Srivalli. And I think that demystifies, or let's say throws light on things that people might not currently think about. We have a lot of entrepreneurs working with us who need to currently import their ingredients, or who need to even they're not necessarily sure how to work with raw materials coming from inside India, which is, I would argue, ironic, tragic, etc., considering the base that we have in agriculture, right? And that's what we mean when we say we want smart protein to integrate into the agri value chain. And just as a quick coda to this part of it before moving on to the next question, this is the promise of India. This is what we're saying we want to exist when it comes to farmers, both as producers as well as consumers, at all socioeconomic levels. If we are able to develop a new economic sector that makes sense across all levels of the value chain, there are a number of benefits that accrue to those same producers, to farmers, right? So if we're able to, for example, create a thriving demand and supply of pulses that go into smart protein, they're processed, let's say, into plant-based meats, plant-based dairy, plant-based snacks, whatever may be the case. They could go abroad, they could be consumed in India. By virtue of that, the farmer themselves are also producing and therefore consuming more pulses, and therefore their nutritional status is improving, right? So the context of all of this in India is vastly different than it is in the rest of the world, right? Burgers are great. We do have to go beyond the burger in India, though, and think about fitting into this context. So with all of that being said, let me throw to someone else who can speak to all of this much better than I can. Ashu, let me ask you once again, as we've discussed in the past, why hasn't all of this already happened? I mean, it seems kind of intuitive and obvious, right? And you speak very cogently to it. I'm convinced. Why haven't we solved these problems? So why haven't farmers already switched to all of these crops that are more sustainable, that are more lucrative? What will it take for a new industry like smart protein to actually have an accelerated path to making all of this happen?
Yeah, I think maybe the most essential thing to remember is that changing what I grow on a farm is incredibly risky, right? So there's kind of two models. One is I'm already producing the necessary inputs, right? That would feed into a value chain for, sustainable, plant-based proteins or the like. In that case, there's really it's a question of like information dissemination and linking up those things, making sure the quality is at the right level. And so that's one problem. Second problem is when you're asking people to switch to new commodities, right? And that's an incredibly risky proposition for a farmer, right? There's so many uncertainties about, will my yield be there? How much am I going to spend on inputs? Am I likely to see a good, sort of outcome at the end of the day? And who bears the risk if something goes wrong, right? And that's where I think really committed and thoughtful sourcing relationships from ingredients companies and food companies can help de-risk that. I think one piece of this that we haven't really spoken about that I think is sort of an adjacency that's related is I think especially for this industry, given how important sustainability and climate credentials are to the end consumer and to the companies that are producing these foods, a farmer in some sense is producing two things. One is a physical commodity, right? Which is the thing that's going to get processed, say the tur dal. They're also producing a stream of data increasingly, right? About how they're producing that, right? And if there's an opportunity for buyers to either pay a premium or to commit to source from farmers that are following certain good agricultural practices, certain sustainable practices that prioritize climate concerns, that prioritize soil health, all these things that actually will pay dividends for the farmer and for all of us as human beings, right? Over time, given how large agriculture is in terms of an emitter, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, that's another angle to this that I think could be really powerful. So why hasn't it happened yet? It hasn't happened yet because changing what you grow and how you grow it, if that's what's required, is incredibly risky. And it's got to, it needs to happen with, in a responsible way. It needs to happen with buyers who are committed to off-taking and helping de-risk that transition for growers. And then I think the other thing I'd say that is related to this point about value chains is seeing how much value addition can happen on farm or on, at kind of like that FPO, that cooperative level, where more of that value addition is actually captured by the producer, is something that could be really, really powerful and move the needle, right? There's a lot of capacity building that needs to happen there. But the funds for those are earmarked, right? There's a lot of interest in providing grants and even debt capital to support that sort of thing. What's missing is that connection to the market to make it like a reliable thing that a producer group can bank on. And with that in place, I think a lot of good things can happen.
Thank you. Yeah, fantastic points there once again. And I should say that, like I said earlier, we have many entrepreneurs working with us who want to integrate into the agri value chain, and large companies from abroad, ingredient companies that already operate in India, etc. They want to integrate into the value chain. Many of these companies share our vision that we could operate with indigenous crops, create value chains, create infrastructure. We've had many sessions during this summit, previous summits. The end game here is, if the US market is the most developed for plant-based foods, like a plant-based yogurt or whatever, someone walking through a Trader Joe's or a Whole Foods in the US should look at the shelf and see a millet-based yogurt that was developed in India, where, as you're saying, Ashu, there should be a traceability component to it. You can point to the millet-based yogurt and say, this was developed in this part of India, the millets were grown in Andhra Pradesh or in Karnataka, and these farmers benefited from it, these were the practices, etc. Right? I think that's an extremely powerful story, and it's an extremely powerful set of principles and impact that I think the consumer would pay for, and that's what we need to happen. I'll come back to you on how we can take action steps moving forward, but at this point, let me go back to Dharani and speak a little bit more about entrepreneurship. Right? Could you offer some case studies of how you've already worked in the past with entrepreneurs or with ministries to link these two pieces together on the agri side, even if it's coming from, let's say, fisheries or aquaculture, on how this kind of thing has developed in the past?
Yeah, so Varun, ours is a relatively new team within the larger Invest India framework. However, I'll give you a few examples how we are working. Right now, we are working with two kinds of stakeholders. One, certain larger players, let's say, for example, take the likes of ADM or some larger conglomerate that is working on regulatory issues. we are trying to work with them to remove those barriers to promote ease of doing business or to export as well. For example, let's say in certain SEZ, a spice trader, a large spice trader, wanted to export organic spices outside India. However, the local officer or somebody was telling that you have to fumigate this, which defeats the whole purpose of it being organic. So we use the whole government mechanism to actually remove that hurdle and fast track this whole process, and sending out a clarification on what the rules are, so that these industry people can use it while negotiating with these local stakeholders or actors who regulate certain things. So such kind of work that we do for entrepreneurs per se. Let's say there is a FPO called Boomgadi, which is based out of Chhattisgarh in Dantewada. So over there, we are trying to help them get access to markets and connect them to different stakeholders. It's predominantly access to markets that most of these people want. They're working with farmers to aggregate demand. Based on the demand, you can grow. At the end of the day, farmers will grow. They are smart people. You don't need to say that, oh, why are you growing only paddy? Because they are rational thinkers. That's the most, like how Ashu was telling, they're risk averse. So earlier when I was working on the field, I used to ask, why are you all doing mota dhan instead of patla dhan? The patla is a better variety, the hybrid variety, and the thinner one, which fetches them better this thing. They said, so this is, I don't need to maintain it much. It is also resistant, and it is easily sold there. Anybody picks it up. So farmer, if you create that demand, farmers will take it up. They are smart at the end of the day. And just adding on, I was just adding on to what Srivalli was telling regarding consumption and production. So consumption, if you look at it, why aren't all these, let's say, millets and all these things being taken up? These have not become aspirational. Earlier, people used to eat these millets. So rice in somewhere in between became aspirational, and people started picking up that. So the demand for rice went up, and even for the nutritional security part, for various reasons, it has happened. So now, if this has to grow for the demand part, this foods need to become aspirational. We have to market these things. So when market sends these signals, people will start to consume more, and yes, the demand will come and they'll grow. And another aspect of how behaviors can be changed is the finance aspect of it. For example, in rural areas where still a lot of finance for farmers come from local traders, they almost decide what the farmers actually will have to grow. So in terms of availability of capital for certain crops or any groups, it is these local traders who decide what they will grow, because they're getting these inputs from these local traders. So at an institutional level, if larger players can come in and actually provide finance for growing these particular crops or any other different models that can be explored, I think the demand will, the production will increase from that side as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dharani. That makes a lot of sense. And part of the reason that we think smart protein represents a promising pillar of integration with agri supply is because these foods are inherently, if you'll forgive my use of the word, they are inherently sexy. The demand exists, they're aspirational, right? So for at least internationally, there's huge demand we've talked about throughout the course of the summit. Plant-based meats, just plant-based meats, not even other categories of smart protein, are evaluated to be anywhere from if you look at Bloomberg or A.T. Kearney, UBS, JP Morgan, any of the organizations that are kind of evaluating this all the time, $95 billion to $370 billion by 2030. Large proportion of that is in international markets. So that's the thing we're going to have to solve, and we'll talk about that. But even in India, the demand is picking up. I think the question becomes, Srivalli, at this early stage, as Dharani said, there may be an additional push that's needed, either interesting models or catalytic finance that can get us from a roadblock where we are now, or a bottleneck where we are now, where not enough people are talking to the agri side or integrating with the agri side from an innovative sector like what we are doing. Could you speak a little bit about the models that you have implemented or how you work with industry or other groups on market development, right? You've talked about how actually markets are extremely important even to subsistence farmers, right? So in a new space, a new innovative market, how do you develop markets so that smart protein becomes, or the inputs to smart protein become as integral to a farmer as rice is, because rice has become very fashionable over the last decades? How do we make that happen?
So a couple of things, Varun. One of the things is just like, in terms of the work that we are doing with a lot of the, I would say, farming community directly. One of the things that is very important, and this is what even Dharani and Ashu had mentioned, that the farmer inherently is able to understand where is the best proposition, but his capacity to move to that is always outweighing the risks that he is able to take. So one of the things that is important is that how do we de-risk that farmer to be able to take that plunge into a new area or a product line that has this niche demand. Secondly, it's always interesting if you see examples of sweet corn or some of the the other mushrooms or things. Initially, that whole behavior of a farmer to have moved into these value chains, there was always an important of identifying your champion farmer, or at least that group which is the early adopter group. And in the light of so many farmer producer organizations that are there now in the country, I would say we are at a better position for an entry point through some of these organizations who are trying to diversify their product baskets. So just to give you an example, there are several of the successful farmer producer organizations who are in the agroecologies where some of these smart protein value chains could kick off. And instead of targeting those individual and making those farmer to come into a group and then asking them and convincing them to grow some of this, your entry point through these FPOs is an easy entry point, because that is a point at which the farmers have already aggregated. Secondly, adding a diversified product basket to an existing FPO will allow for more stickiness of the members of the farmer producer organization to continue doing business with that FPO. Because one, you are talking about a new product line, you would be providing them with some technical know-how, seeds, inputs, and so forth, but there is a definitive market linkage. So it's assuring a definitive market linkage will again bring in more stickiness of the members of that particular FPO to continue doing business with you. The critical area that we will have to really crack is that how do you identify which product line for which agroecology? And this is something that you would have to do a little bit of business case analysis in terms of where does it make more sense and the economies of scale, because you would also have to look at what is the grade of the produce that will be coming into your or the industry's hand, who's going to make that tie up with that particular line. And I just wanted to quote an example here, and this is a program that we are doing in partnership with Digital Green, wherein we just looked at one commodity and we were trying to really crowdsource different ag tech innovations into that one commodity in one geography. And what we saw was, even after bringing in so many different innovations, the ability of farmer to move from a product quality B to A is a huge change in itself. And if you are only going to offtake A quality, who is going to take the B quality? So it is important that you are entering into a contract with an FPO for purchasing everything that they grow. Some portion can go into whatever that can be processed, whatever A, B, C quality. And this is where I feel a lot of our new agtech innovations that have come into being, especially in terms of how they are able to interact with a lot of these farmers, you can actually tap into some of their expertise as well. So everyone cannot do everything. I think that is a clear line that you'll have to take. But entry point through these farmer aggregation models, through some of these existing and I would say low hanging FPOs, which are able to be the early adopters, will be a good entry point for a new industry like this to really kick off. Because all these FPOs and the members are looking at is an assured market. And believe me, if you're giving them an assured market and a decent enough price and a decent share of the traded price, they will be sticking on with you to continue doing business.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I don't want to take too much time, because I want to share a final round of questions. Frankly, I wasn't anticipating that we would get to the how so much on this discussion. I think it's fantastic, right? What I said at the beginning was we'd get to a shared understanding of where we are. but I think we've dived really deep into the how, because it's about the what and the how. We think smart protein is a very important piece of the what, because it is a lucrative end market into which farmers can sell their produce, right? And that's happening globally, right? But we think India can be the first major player, first major country in smart protein that centers things like nutrition, welfare of the farmer, etc., for a rapidly growing new industry. Other countries are doing it. Denmark announced a national plan which has about $90 million of funding for farmers to switch to crops that would go into plant-based foods, etc. But we think India can do it at a larger scale, right? And we don't want to miss out either. So my final round of questions for everyone, and I'll start with you, Dharani, is what next? How can we work with Ashu, Srivalli, yourself? You've all mentioned that we need to create these verticalized proofs of concept. We need to move forward. So how can we work with you? How can we work with Invest India? What do you need from us? Whom should we be bringing to the table? Individuals, collective action. What do we do next?
A simple, straightforward answer would be that, okay, who are the people who are producing, and if they can give demand for that, yeah, we would be happy to connect them with the FPOs or organizations, or we can use the government mechanism to actually work with a group of farmers in certain locations to actually mobilize that production in certain clusters in terms of availability of raw materials per se. And then another side of it, if you look at it, if you want it to create an ecosystem in that, we have to identify, okay, these are all the opportunities over there, and in that context we can create an opportunity paper and do these awareness events which are there. We could use maybe our startup wings and all to bring in entrepreneurs and tell them, hey, there is an opportunity, you can pick it up. We don't need large players in this whole ecosystem. Even like small enterprises can take this up and start to work with farmer collectives to procure from them, and maybe even financial institutions who are into this provide some finance to farmers, or through input providers subsidize it. Such things can be explored. How we typically go about doing it is we do an opportunity paper, understand, identify these are all the opportunities, map who all can be open into this, and work with them closely. And yeah, that's broadly how we go about it.
Thank you, Dharani. And yeah, I think everyone's already mentioned early champions, and then moving very rapidly from there to scale, I think makes a lot of sense. So thank you for highlighting that we can work with smaller entrepreneurs at the beginning, help them access agri value chains, and really build out an ecosystem of support for all of this. So Srivalli, similar question. I mean, you've highlighted some really fascinating insights here. How can we work with BMGF or with the broader agri ecosystem to make this a reality, and move forward into at least trying some experiments on integrating into the agri value chain here?
So, Varun, we already have some large programs that are growing on the ground in the states that I mentioned, in the UP, Bihar, and Odisha, where we work closely with the departments of agriculture. But these are large programs that are designed in collaboration with larger investors such as World Bank and IFAD and others. And what we have also done, and in collaboration with Invest India in the last 1 year, is to be able to connect some of these innovators to these farmer and farmer producer organization to test out these innovations. And we've seen a lot of success there, because it's not that the farmers are not ready to adopt these technologies, but we can actually introduce you to more than I would say anywhere between 300 to 400 FPOs who are working in directly with the foundations programs in some of these states. And some of these states are also key growing areas for high protein pulses. And secondly, we also have an incubator that we have set together with the Social Alpha, which is the India Agritech Incubator Network. So if there are some innovative startups that are there in the space who want to test out a product line, that or in collaboration with a Good Food Institute, and be able to work directly with farmers, we could even get them to work together with the incubator that we have with IIT Kanpur. The third line that we are also working in is some of the larger programs that we are working on are also working in terms of how can they raise some capital, because a lot of the times it's not only the the procurement linkage, but can we set up some primary level processing. Together with the Ministry of Agriculture through the Agriculture Infrastructure Development Fund, we have been working in terms of catalyzing some of the large private sector investments in infrastructure in some of the states like Madhya Pradesh and others. And again, we know where these processing facilities are there. And if we can connect some of the producers to processing facilities to be able to take some of these offtake markets, we'd be more than happy to do. So lots of opportunities and lots of areas where we would be very keen to engage with private sector, because we think that is the only way we can really bring in sustainability going forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like I said, this year we're all about moving from conversation to action, because we don't have time to wait around until 2030 and then wonder why we didn't achieve our promises under the Sustainable Development Goals. I think a lot of action steps, then we'd love to take it forward. Ashu, just the final word in terms of next steps. I'd love to think through how we could work on the how here, right? Integrating backwards into agri value chains. What would be your recommended next steps, either in terms of individual one-to-one engagements or even collective action of how we can come together here to build this out?
I think what both panelists before me talked about is spot on, right? You need demand signals, right? You need to help mobilize investment and build capacity of the FPOs to be able to meet that demand. From a digital green perspective, that's obviously something we think about a lot, right? So it has to be a two-way street. We've talked a lot about putting the pressure on the entrepreneurs and food companies that are listening here to, like, you know, give your demand orders. Well, what you need is reliable supply of consistent quality. And so from a digital green perspective, that's kind of one of the areas where we focus, which is like, how do you ensure consistent and good agricultural practices? And then how do you actually verify that they're happening in the way that you want them to be, especially because that, we think, is a pretty important part of the story, right? That's being told to the consumer about why they should buy this particular product, right? Some of it's on the nutritional side and the protein content and everything, but a lot of it is, you know, I'm doing something that's better for the environment, and the equity and justice argument of I'm doing something that's actually being grown in a way that's that's nature positive and that is fair and equitable to the producer is there's a lot of information to be communicated and collected and disseminated back out, and those are the sorts of things that we have some tools that we've been working on to help facilitate. So the digital green piece is I think helping ensure the farmers can produce in a way that really delivers on the requirements of the buyers, and then help capture the information that might be really relevant from a traceability and marketing perspective to the end customer.
Thank you so much. And like I've said before, I think the what to our mind, and of course we're focused on this space, but the what to our mind is very well established, given that a lot of the sustainability is inherent in the what when you're switching from a livestock-based meat to a plant-based meat or something else. The sustainability piece is well established, but there are also, as Ashu said, nature-positive ways of doing the how, right? And I think when you're talking about the how as well, there's a lot of detail involved. So we'd love to take this forward and take conversation to action. We'll certainly be following up with each of you. If you are in the audience, as Ashu said, I think a lot of entrepreneurs who speak with us are perhaps scared of the agri value chain, are mystified by how to integrate within it. All three panelists here have given very actionable ways for us to engage moving forward, and we'd love to take it ahead. I should also say that all of our key sponsors and title sponsors, a lot of them are in the ingredient space, right? And a significant portion of the success we've had stimulating entrepreneurship in our sector has been in engaging with these key sponsors and title sponsors. So in the networking break after this, please go to their booths and talk about a lot of these things on co-development, on integrating into agri supply, on how you can essentially set up your smart protein dream and move this industry forward. Thank you so much, Ashu, Srivalli, Dharani. I think I have a lot of follow-up to do with you guys next week, but this has been really fascinating. I couldn't have asked for a better framing of how to integrate into the agri supply chain.
Thank you, Varun.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thanks, Ashu.
you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Srivalli.
everyone.
Take care, everyone. We'll see you soon.